The Sherlock Holmes Advent Calendar. The Redeemer's Coming, by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and Nora Godwin. Narrated by Peter Silverleaf. 6. Confession. Soon it was obvious that the wooden confessional box, a large 2 centuries-old piece of furniture with ornate carvings by a northern Italian altar builder, could not be saved. The fire completely surrounded it. The flames were already bursting through the collapsing ceiling. Therefore, the main focus of the monastic fire brigade shifted to securing the rest of the building. The church benches were hastily placed to the opposite wall, where the fire could not reach them at first. Even more important, however, was the altar. In a hurry, its parts were dismantled and removed, as were the existing objects that were used during Mass and some relics that were necessary in every Catholic church. Only the large central crucifix with the suffering Messiah on it, which was attached to the wall behind the altar, had to be left behind. But the modest, sparse, almost barren furnishings of the central prayer room of the Franciscan chapel became its salvation. Even though the confessional box inevitably fell victim to the fire, not much was left within the massive stone walls, which was within reach of the fire source. Fortunately, the wooden cross beams of the hall did not run directly over the high simmering flames, and the floor was also made of stone, so the fire could not spread to the building itself. The immense heat and thick smoke emanating from the burning confessional proved to be quite dangerous on its own. 2 friars collapsed, and 3 brothers I had to treat later for flue gas poisoning. Also, some slight burns of particularly careless firefighters were to be lamented. But in the end, when the confessional box collapsed into an internally still glowing but rendered harmless rubble, we, Lestrade and I, were immediately placed in a human bucket chain and quickly gained complete control over the situation. The cold winter wind blowing through the windows that were open everywhere drove away the clouds of smoke, and we stood happily with wet feet in the flowing fire water. In the meantime, the disabled Holmes and the elderly abbot had also arrived and inspected the damage, and I joined them as I wiped sweat and soot from my face with my handkerchief. The confessional box was a pile of charred pieces of wood and ash that the wind began to swirl. The wall behind it was somewhat damaged but held up. Otherwise, the hall was sooted everywhere. Even the face and the body of the Messiah, who was still hanging on the wall opposite the entrance to his cross, was blackened to such an extent that one might think that Jesus of Nazareth came from southern Africa. "It seems," the abbot said, "as if we had gotten off fairly lightly. However, it is likely that the Lord is not yet finished with his trials." "Lord?" asked Holmes. "Believe me, Brother Francis, this is not God's work, nor is it a coincidence, but a message from the perpetrator. Undoubtedly the confessional box was deliberately set on fire by him. After all, he was expected to make a confession this morning. I think that's obsolete." "Not at all," the abbot replied with a stern gaze. "Confession can also take place face to face. We will do it tomorrow in the office room, and the perpetrator now has another thing to confess." Brother Francis's optimism did not convince the recently approached Inspector Lestrade in the slightest. "With all due respect, Reverend," he said, breathing heavily, "you probably didn't understand the perpetrator's message. He clearly wants you to stick that godforsaken confession up your—" "Thank you, Inspector," Holmes interrupted him just in time. "I think we all understood the message very well, but we will not be intimidated. That's our message." "Holmes is right," I immediately interjected. "The guy wants to play with fire, then he will burn himself." "Well, we should all go to bed now," Holmes said. "Tomorrow will be a busy day. May it be an uneventful one, and good night." Holmes and the abbot bade each other a good night, while I was still caring for the injured friars. I took care of the burns, breathing difficulties, and exhaustion that they were complaining about, with Lestrade assisting me. Fortunately, there were no serious injuries. But during the treatments, I kept wondering if the perpetrator was among the patients. What better way to camouflage than to be one of the victims of one's own arson? But after an hour, when the medical care of the injured was finally done, the tiredness soon overwhelmed me and dispersed my thoughts. In the chapel, however, some of the friars, taking turns of course, guarded the glowing remains of the confessional box in order to prevent a resurgence of the fire, if necessarily immediately. In this respect, we all went to bed and found our much-needed sleep. The next morning, Holmes was the first to get on his feet and came back from the lavatories in a good mood, when Lestrade and I also woke up, not entirely voluntarily, since Holmes whistled a song as he came in, quite fittingly the Hallelujah from Handel's Messiah or Oratorio, although he couldn't exactly replace a four-part chorus. I immediately saw through our little window that it was still dark outside. "For heaven's sake, Holmes," I lamented, "isn't it a little early for such joy?" But Holmes just shouted, "Good, that you're awake already, Watson. Well now, gentlemen, life in the convent is hard but just. We have to swim along with the mainstream of this fraternity like a fish. That's why we're going to stick to their daily routine." Lestrade moaned, rolled over his bed, and only said, "The devil take you, Holmes." "Na. Holmes immediately rebuked him with his index finger raised. "That's hardly the appropriate use of words in these sacred walls." "Are you a Catholic now, old boy?" asked Lestrade amusedly. "Not at all," Holmes replied with a serious face. "That would imply definitely too much hocus-pocus for my part. But as I said, we shall swim like fish in the water, and I also intend to be like a pike in the fish-pond, so that we will soon have a catch." Tired of Holmes' ichthyological analogies, I brought myself to get up. With my unconditional capitulation, even Lestrade's resistance was broken, so we trotted into the lavatories together, and after a few minutes we actually came back surprisingly fresh and cheerful to get dressed. And as planned by Holmes, we showed up in time for the Friars' breakfast in the dining-room. At this time we took a seat in the immediate vicinity of the door. The smell of the fire was still filling the air. The morning meal was again worthy of a mendicant order. We had a few slices of hard bread with a point of a knife of butter, along with lukewarm water, which was wrongly called tea. As far as I could see, all the friars were here. The possibility that the perpetrator could have tried to escape at night, which had come to my mind in the meantime, proved to be inaccurate. Only the abbot and the vicar were missing. Later on we found out that they were already busy preparing the confession in the office room. The brothers present made a tired, fought-off impression, but the mood was quite positive after all. The previous evening they had succeeded in stopping an impending fire in the abbey. "Why aren't we mingling amongst our fellow brethren?" I asked Holmes, whispering. "What about the fish and the water?" "My dear Watson," Holmes explained, "here is the best place to watch. All of the friars must pass us. We will carefully observe every face that goes to confession after breakfast. It should be any moment." In fact, as if he heard us, the abbot appeared in the door. He greeted us with a slight nod and then addressed the assembled brothers. "Let's begin," he shouted into the room. "Please come to the ministry one by one. Brother Peter will now take the confession from you." Brother Francis disappeared, again with a look in our direction, and the first of the friars soon followed him. As he passed us, Holmes smiled at him kindly and wished him a good morning. The brother answered the greeting politely, but continued his journey unabated. Lestrade's stern expression, with which he probably suspected everyone, was ignored. This process was repeated 23 times in subsequent episodes, which was, honestly, pretty boring. The hall emptied continuously. Only we remained seated in our seats. Only the very last friar, who came after more than an hour, set out for confession, stopped at our table. "I am Brother Nicholas," declared the tall, frail man, who seemed almost ancient to me with his long white beard. "Maybe we can have a talk afterwards." "Certainly," said Holmes, who was surprised. "Where can we find you?" "In the library," replied the old Franciscan, "because it is subject to my administration. Come in 2 hours. I think I can help you with your investigation." At that moment Brother Francis was back in the door. "Ah, Brother Nicholas," he said, and approached him. "You are the last one. Come, let me help you." The abbot gave the elderly librarian his right arm to support him on his way to confession. Truly a very fraternal gesture. Addressing us, Brother Francis said, "Gentlemen, please wait here. Brother Peter and I will be able to talk to you in a bit." And then the two monks left the dining room together with slow and careful steps, and we were alone, free to talk. That might be of interest, I guessed after a short wait. Maybe the old man knows something about the murder. Or about the fire, Lestrade added. Whatever it is, Holmes said, we'll find out soon. In any case, it is important to Brother Nicholas to put faith in us. This could be the very first loose stone in a wall of silence. With these words, however, it was Holmes who fell into a long silence. Without taking further notice, Holmes opened the Bible he had taken from Brother Emmanuel's room and began scrolling through it. Lestrade, who was already annoyed from waiting for what he considered to be a pointless action, did not hold back on showing it, tapping his fingers on the tabletop or tapping the soles of his shoes on the floor. I, for my part, looked closely at what Holmes was reading and tried to find out what he was looking for. Of course, I was unable to do so. In the end, I managed to unhinge his momentarily created balance. After 10 minutes, Holmes had had enough and looked in my face with a serious expression. "For God's sake, Watson," he almost snapped, "now ask your question." After a moment of shock, I was able to gather myself again and replied, "Well, Holmes, you brought your own Bible from London. What do you want with the Bible of the murder victim? What do you hope to find in it?" Holmes smiled good-naturedly. "This," he said, handing me the opened book of books. Before me I had the beginning of the Gospel of Luke, conception and birth of Jesus and John the Baptist. What Holmes studied, however, was not primarily the printed word, but rather handwritten additions with pencil. Apparently someone, presumably Brother Emmanuel, had underlined a few lines, added exclamation points in several places, and unfortunately unreadable words. "What might that be?" I thought aloud, giving the Bible back to my friend. "Individuality," Holmes replied contentedly, "and a clue." "What for?" I asked. But Holmes only took a sympathetic look and replied, "How am I supposed to know?" I almost burst into resounding laughter, but I held back when I noticed that the abbot and the vicar were coming in. "Gentlemen," Brother Francis proclaimed, "the confession is over, and I have to tell you that we have found out about something deeply disturbing."